cruel uncle auctioned her for mining debt, until Cowboy won and freed her dreams. Maria was born in a small, dusty town that lay in the shadow of a long, rugged mountain range. The town was not much more than a scattering of wooden houses, a few stores, and a large mining camp that brought both life and trouble to the area. The air often smelled of smoke and dust, and the ground was hard and dry, cracked under the harsh sun. Maria's mother worked tirelessly to provide for her small family, cleaning houses and sewing clothes for the townsfolk. Her life was simple but filled with warmth. Maria had no siblings, so her mother's love was her whole world. She grew up in a small, creaking house with a tiny garden where her mother grew vegetables, and every evening they would sit together, sharing stories and laughter, forgetting for a little while the hardships outside. But happiness can be fragile in a town like theirs. When Maria was just 10, her mother became sick. The illness came slowly at first, a lingering weakness that made her cough and tire easily. Maria, though still young, tried to help. She would fetch water from the well, sweep the floors, and help cook simple meals. She watched over her mother as best as she could, but the sickness was relentless. People in town whispered about the dangers of the mining dust, about how life there could be cruel. But Maria had never thought such cruelty would touch her own family. One cold morning, after a long night of coughing and fever, her mother passed away. Maria felt the emptiness of the house immediately. The laughter, the warmth, the love, everything vanished in a single moment. She cried herself to sleep, clutching her mother's worn shawl, unable to understand why the world could be so unfair. With her mother gone, Maria had no one to care for her. Her mother's distant relatives lived far away and were unable to help. That left her uncle, a man Maria had barely known, who claimed he would take her in. But from the first day she entered his home, Maria sensed that something was wrong. The house was cold, and her uncle was cold. He rarely spoke to her kindly and often made her do chores that seemed endless, carrying water, chopping wood, scrubbing floors, until her hands were raw and sore. He never smiled, and he never asked how she felt. Maria's heart ached for the warmth she had lost, but she tried to obey quietly, believing that perhaps this was how life was meant to be. It didn't take long for Maria to discover her uncle's true nature. He had debts from gambling and failed business deals, and he saw Maria not as a niece, but as a way to pay them off. She overheard him speaking to neighbors, speaking in a harsh tone she had never heard directed at anyone before. He spoke of auctioning her, of selling her to someone who would pay his debts. Maria froze, unable to believe that her life could be treated like an object, something to be traded like cattle or tools. She could not sleep for many nights, lying awake in the dark, wondering how her mother could be gone and how her uncle could be so cruel. She tried to find solace in small things: a flower that grew stubbornly through the dirt near the kitchen, the songs of birds in the morning. But nothing could fill the hollow fear growing inside her. As the days passed, Maria began to notice other children in town. Some had families that cared for them, and some were orphans like her, but none seemed to fear their guardians as she feared her uncle. He rarely left her alone, watching her with sharp eyes, and often spoke to her about paying for debts as if she were something less than human. Maria felt trapped. She wanted to run, but the town was small, and every road seemed to lead back to him. She tried to speak to adults in the town for help, but many turned away, afraid of angering her uncle or facing their own troubles. Maria's life became a daily exercise in caution, trying to avoid her uncle's anger while holding on to the tiny scraps of hope she had. Despite the darkness surrounding her, Maria's mind often wandered to dreams. She remembered the books she had read at the small school her mother had taken her to, stories of faraway places and people who overcame impossible odds. She dreamed of walking through green fields, of breathing clean air, and of meeting people who would treat her with kindness. Sometimes in the dead of night, she would whisper to herself that she would one day escape, that she would see the mountains beyond the town, that she would live freely. These dreams became her secret world, a place where she could be brave and strong even if the real world would not allow her to show it. Maria's life with her uncle grew harsher as the auction day drew near. He had been talking to strangers, men who came to his home with rough hands and sharper eyes, men who would bid for a girl's life like she were a commodity. Maria had no control over this, no say, no protection. She began to notice the fear in her own reflection, the quiet desperation in her eyes when she looked into the mirror. She tried to stay busy with chores, hoping to avoid noticing the growing shadow over her life, but it was impossible to ignore. Each conversation her uncle had with potential bidders made her heart pound. Each night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling powerless and alone. But even in this darkness, small acts of hope reminded her that the world could still have kindness. One neighbor, an old woman who had watched Maria grow up, would leave her small gifts, an apple, a piece of bread, or a few coins, and whispered words of encouragement. "Stay strong, child," the woman would say. "Someone will come to see your worth. Never forget that." These small gestures became Maria's lifeline. They reminded her that she was not completely alone, that even in a town filled with greed and hardship, there were people who believed in her value, who believed in her dreams. As the auction day approached, Maria began to prepare herself in secret. She practiced standing tall, holding her head high, and speaking when necessary. She tried to imagine that someone out there would see her as more than a burden, someone who would recognize her courage and her intelligence. Though fear often overwhelmed her, she clung tightly to the belief that freedom was possible. It became her quiet rebellion, the way she could fight back against a world that wanted to reduce her to an object. Every night she told herself, "I will survive. I will be more than this. I will not be forgotten." Finally, the morning of the auction arrived. The town gathered, and the miners, businessmen, and other curious onlookers filled the dusty square. Maria felt a cold sweat on her forehead, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to appear calm, to hide the trembling that ran through her arms and legs. She wore the simple dress her mother had sewn for her, the only piece of clothing that reminded her of love and safety. The crowd murmured, the air thick with anticipation, and Maria felt her uncle's shadow looming over her, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Though terror gripped her, Maria also felt something new, a tiny spark of hope. She had no idea what the day would bring, but she clung to the belief that freedom could still be possible, that her dreams were not completely lost. She thought of the life she had imagined, the life she had promised herself in secret, and in that moment, standing in the dusty town square, she made a silent vow to herself. No matter what happened, she would hold on to hope, she would find courage, and she would not let anyone take away the person she was meant to become. The day of the auction arrived with a strange stillness in the air, broken only by the occasional creak of wooden wagons and the soft murmur of people gathering. Maria stood quietly in the corner of the dusty town square, her heart hammering like a drum in her chest. The sun was high, relentless in its heat, beating down on the wooden stalls and the people who crowded around them. She clutched the edge of her dress tightly, feeling its thin fabric scratch against her palms. Fear and uncertainty swirled inside her like a storm. She had no idea what would happen next, only that her life was about to change in a way she could not yet understand. Around her, townspeople whispered to each other, their voices low and full of curiosity. Some were miners, their clothes darkened with dust and sweat, rough hands resting on the wooden railings that separated the bidders from the girl. Others were merchants or strangers from neighboring towns wearing slightly finer clothes but with eyes sharp and calculating, always seeking opportunity. Maria noticed their glances, the way they looked at her as though she were an object rather than a person. Her stomach twisted at the thought that her life could be bought and sold like a sack of grain or a bag of coins. She tried to steady her breathing, willing herself to remain calm, but it was nearly impossible. Her uncle stood nearby, smirking, his eyes gleaming with greed and satisfaction. He did not notice her fear. He only saw the debt he would soon erase with the highest bid. He had spent weeks preparing for this day, speaking with men in hushed tones, convincing them of Maria's obedience and usefulness. He bragged about how easy it would be to find a buyer willing to pay enough to clear his debts. Maria felt a wave of anger mixed with sorrow. How could someone who claimed to be family see her as nothing more than a means to money? She swallowed hard, reminding herself that the day would end somehow, and that she had to survive until it did. The auctioneer, a tall man with a booming voice and a gavel that seemed almost too large for his hand, stepped forward. He cleared his throat and called for silence, his voice echoing across the square. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have a special offering," he said, pausing to let the words sink in. "A young girl, known to her guardians as Maria. She is strong, obedient, and ready to serve. Let the bidding begin."
The crowd murmured, some nodding, others laughing softly. Maria felt as though the walls were closing in. Every word the auctioneer spoke made her stomach churn. Every glance from the crowd felt like a chain tightening around her spirit. As the bidding began, hands shot up quickly, offering sums of money that made her uncle grin with satisfaction. Maria tried to focus on anything but the numbers, anything but the reality that she was being sold. She looked at the ground, the dry dirt that had been her playground as a child, and felt tears prick her eyes. She wanted to cry out, to run, to shout that she was not a thing to be bought, but no sound came from her trembling lips. The people around her were too loud, too numerous, and she felt as though her voice had been swallowed by the dusty air. Then, from the back of the crowd, she noticed a man standing apart from the others. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing worn boots and a cowboy hat that shaded his eyes. His face was calm, almost stern, but there was a softness in the way he looked at her, a kindness that she had not seen in anyone that day. Maria felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark that told her she might not be completely alone. The man did not speak to the auctioneer or the bidders. He simply watched, his hands resting lightly on the leather strap of his belt.
There was something steady about him, something that seemed to promise protection without needing to make a grand gesture. As the auction continued, the bidding rose higher and higher. Men shouted numbers, waved coins, and jostled each other, each trying to outdo the other. Maria felt herself shrinking into the corner, wishing she could disappear entirely.
She hated the sound of her uncle's laugh, so greedy and cruel, echoing above the crowd. She hated the glances of the bidders, the way they measured her as if she were nothing more than a tool or a prize. And yet, through it all, she kept her eyes on the man at the back, the cowboy. He had not yet raised his hand, not yet spoken a word, but she sensed that he was different. He was not there to take advantage, not there to harm. And somehow that made her heart beat a little faster with cautious hope. Finally, after what felt like hours, the crowd began to grow restless. Some men muttered under their breath, lowering their bids, uninterested in paying more. Her uncle's grin faltered slightly, worry creeping into his face for the first time that day. Then, in a calm voice that carried across the square, the cowboy spoke.
"I'll pay what she's worth,"
he said, his words steady and measured. The auctioneer's eyes widened, and a hush fell over the crowd. The men who had been bidding began to whisper to each other, confused and irritated. Maria's uncle turned sharply, his face twisting in disbelief.
"What do you mean?" he demanded. "You can't just—"
But the cowboy interrupted him with another firm voice.
"I mean, the girl is free if I pay the sum needed. That is all."
The silence that followed was heavy. Bidders stared at the cowboy, unsure how to respond. The auctioneer cleared his throat, muttering about rules and procedures, but even he seemed taken aback by the calm authority in the man's voice. Her uncle's face turned red with fury. He stepped forward, pointing at the cowboy, his hands shaking.
"You can't just take her," he shouted. "She belongs to me, and I'll take the highest bid."
The cowboy did not flinch. He looked steadily at her uncle, his voice quiet but unwavering. "The highest bid is mine."
"Pay the debt, and she is free. No harm will come to her."
Maria felt a strange sensation in her chest, something she had not felt in a long time. Relief mingled with disbelief. Could it really be happening?
Could someone truly see her as a person, not a possession? She wanted to speak, to thank him, to tell him she had dreamed of this moment for so long, but her throat felt tight, and the words would not come.
She could only watch, trembling, as the cowboy placed his money on the table, enough to cover the debts her uncle had racked up over the years. The uncle's expression darkened, then shifted to shock, then to rage. He realized there was nothing he could do. The gavel fell, the crowd fell silent, and Maria's life changed in an instant. The cowboy stepped forward, offering his hand to Maria.
"Come with me,"
he said simply. She hesitated for only a moment before taking it, feeling the warmth of his hand and the steadiness of his presence. It was the first time in weeks that she felt safe. that she felt she could breathe without fear. The crowd murmured around them, some whispering admiration, others anger, but Maria barely noticed. She was focused entirely on the man who had saved her, on the first taste of freedom she had ever known. As they walked away from the auction, Maria's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: relief, gratitude, disbelief, and a quiet, burgeoning hope all mixed together. She could hardly believe that after everything, after the fear and suffering, she was finally free. The cowboy who introduced himself as Jack spoke softly as they left the town square behind.
"You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said. "You're safe now." Maria felt tears slip down her cheeks. But this time they were not tears of despair.
They were tears of relief, tears of the first taste of hope she had felt in a long time. That day, as they walked toward the hills beyond the town, Maria began to imagine a new life. She pictured a home where she could laugh without fear, where she could read books and learn new things, where she could dream without limits. The pain of her past would not disappear, and she knew she would carry memories of her uncle's cruelty forever, but for the first time she believed that her life could belong to her. She had survived, and now, with Jack's help, she could begin to reclaim the dreams she had almost lost. Even as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, Maria walked beside Jack with a steady step. She had left behind fear, oppression, and cruelty. That day marked not only her freedom but the start of a journey toward self-discovery, toward trust, and toward the dreams she had once thought were impossible. And though she did not yet know the challenges that lay ahead, she felt ready to face them, armed with the courage that had kept her alive through the darkest days of her childhood. After the auction, Maria felt as if she were walking in a dream. The town, once filled with whispers and stares, was now behind her. Ahead stretched the open landscape, rolling hills, wide meadows, and the mountains rising proudly in the distance. She walked beside Jack, the cowboy who had rescued her, his presence steady and comforting. Every step away from the town seemed to lighten her heart, yet fear lingered like a shadow. She had been trapped for so long that the idea of freedom felt almost strange, almost unreal. What if it didn't last? What if the world outside the town was just as cruel as the one she had left behind? Jack noticed her hesitation and spoke gently. "You don't need to be afraid, Maria.
"You're safe now. No one can force you to do anything you don't want."
His voice was calm, without judgment, without expectation. Maria looked at him, her eyes wide, unsure how to respond.
She had spent years obeying someone else's will, never having a choice, and the sudden freedom was both wonderful and terrifying. She wanted to trust him, but trusting someone again after her uncle's cruelty felt almost impossible.
The first few days at Jack's ranch were quiet. Maria spent most of her time observing, learning the rhythm of the place. The ranch was small but lively, with a few horses, chickens clucking in the yard, and fields of crops stretching toward the hills. Jack worked from dawn until dusk, tending to the animals and the land, but he always found moments to check on her.
He taught her simple tasks at first: feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, watering the small garden. These tasks seemed ordinary, but for Maria, they were the first lessons in independence.
She realized that caring for something or someone, even in small ways, could give her a sense of control over her life. In the evenings, after the chores were done, Jack encouraged Maria to rest, read, or simply sit and watch the sunset. He never pressured her to speak or share her past, but he always made it clear that he would listen if she ever wanted to. Slowly, Maria began to open up, at first with small words, then longer sentences. She told him about her mother, about the garden she had tended as a child, and about the dreams she had kept hidden in her heart. Jack listened quietly, nodding, never interrupting, offering small reassurances that it was safe to speak. It was a strange feeling for Maria to be treated with patience and kindness, but it was also incredibly comforting. One afternoon, while gathering firewood near the edge of the ranch, Maria watched Jack ride one of the horses with ease and skill. She felt a pang of longing. She had always admired the freedom of the animals, the way they could move across the land without fear or restraint.
Jack noticed her gaze. "Would you like to learn?" he asked.
Maria hesitated, unsure if she could ride. She had never even sat on a horse before. But something in his calm smile encouraged her. "Yes," she whispered. The first attempts were clumsy. Maria struggled to mount the horse, to hold the reins, to balance as the animal moved. She stumbled, nearly fell, and felt frustration rise within her. But Jack was patient. He steadied the horse, adjusted her posture, and guided her slowly. "It's okay," he said. "Take your time. The horse can sense fear, but it can also sense confidence. Start small, and you will learn." Day by day, Maria practiced. She fell many times, scraped her knees, and got covered in dirt and dust, but each time she rose, determined to succeed. Gradually, she learned to trust the horse, and in the process, she began to trust herself. As the days turned into weeks, Maria's confidence grew. She learned not only how to ride, but how to care for the animals, how to tend the crops, and how to maintain the ranch. Jack taught her the value of patience, hard work, and observation. He never spoke harshly, never demanded perfection, but guided her with encouragement. Maria discovered a new kind of strength within herself, a strength that came from knowledge, skill, and the ability to take care of something on her own. She realized that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined, and that realization brought a deep sense of pride. Yet Maria's healing was not only physical. She had carried fear and trauma in her heart for so long that it sometimes surfaced in nightmares. She would wake in the night, sweating and shaking, recalling her uncle's cruel words, the faces of strangers at the auction, and the sense of being powerless. Jack noticed these nights and never scolded her for her fear. Instead, he would quietly sit by her, sometimes offering a hand to hold, sometimes simply speaking softly, until she felt calm enough to sleep. Slowly, these nights became less frequent, and Maria began to face the memories without being overwhelmed by them. She learned that courage did not mean forgetting the past, but facing it and continuing forward. In the quiet moments, Maria began to explore her own creativity. Jack had a small collection of books, some old and worn, some newer, covering stories, poems, and histories. Maria found solace in the pages, losing herself in tales of adventure, heroism, and distant lands. She began to write her own thoughts, small notes at first, then longer stories. Writing became a way to process her feelings, to turn fear and pain into words, and in doing so she began to see that her voice mattered. She realized that even though she had been silenced for so long, her thoughts, ideas, and dreams were important, and she had the right to share them. Maria also began to form bonds with the animals on the ranch. The horses, chickens, and even the quiet barn cats became companions, teaching her patience, gentleness, and care. She found joy in watching a chick hatch, in grooming a horse, in seeing the crops grow from tiny seedlings into healthy plants. These small victories, these tiny acts of nurturing, reminded her that life could be gentle and rewarding, that she could have control and purpose in her actions. Every day she felt a little stronger, a little braver, and a little more like herself. Jack became more than a rescuer to Maria. He became a mentor and a friend. He never demanded her gratitude, but he offered guidance, support, and patience. He allowed her to make decisions, to take risks, and even to fail, teaching her that mistakes were not weaknesses but opportunities to learn. Slowly, Maria's trust in him grew, not because he had saved her, but because he treated her with respect, kindness, and understanding. For the first time, she felt that not all men were cruel, that not all authority figures sought to control or harm. She began to believe that people could be trustworthy and that hope could exist even after deep suffering. The more Maria learned and grew, the more she began to think about her future. She realized that she had dreams she still wanted to pursue, dreams of learning, of writing, and of helping others who might find themselves trapped, as she once had been. She began to make plans, small at first, but growing bolder with each passing day. She imagined a life where she could choose her path, where she could help others find freedom and hope, and where her past would not define her, but instead give her strength. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Maria sat on the porch of the ranch house, writing in her notebook. Jack joined her, sitting quietly, watching the horizon. She looked up and smiled, feeling a sense of peace she had never known. "I never thought I could feel like this," she said softly. Jack nodded, his eyes kind.
You deserve this peace, Maria. You worked for it, even if you didn't know it at first. And this is just the beginning.
Maria realized he was right. The journey was far from over, but she had taken the first steps toward reclaiming her life. She had survived her uncle's cruelty, endured the auction, and now, with guidance, patience, and her own courage, she was learning to live freely. The skills she gained, the trust she built, and the confidence she nurtured were more valuable than any treasure. She understood now that freedom was not just the absence of chains, but the presence of choice, courage, and hope. By the end of the season, Maria had transformed from a frightened, uncertain girl into a young woman with a growing sense of independence and purpose. She rode the horses confidently, tended the garden and animals with care, wrote stories that captured her thoughts, and faced her fears with a quiet strength. She still remembered the auction, her uncle, and the fear she had felt, but those memories no longer controlled her. Instead, they served as reminders of how far she had come, how strong she could be, and how important it was to protect her dreams. Through every challenge and every triumph, Maria realized that trust, kindness, and perseverance could heal even the deepest wounds. And as she stood on the porch one evening, feeling the wind brush against her face and watching the sun disappear behind the mountains, she understood that the life she had once only dreamed of was now within reach.
The journey was just beginning, but for the first time she felt ready to embrace it fully, confident that she could shape her own destiny. The years passed quietly at first, but each day brought growth, learning, and small victories for Maria.
The girl who had once lived in fear under her cruel uncle's roof had become a young woman filled with courage and determination. She had learned to ride horses across open fields, to tend the animals and crops, and to care for the little ranch she now called home. Yet, more importantly, she had learned to trust herself, to believe in her worth, and to imagine a future she had once thought impossible. Maria's mornings began early, with the sun spilling golden light across the hills. She fed the animals, gathered eggs, and helped Jack with his work. But she no longer saw these chores as burdens. They were opportunities to contribute, to feel capable, and to discover joy in the simplest things. She took pride in her work, in the growing garden, the healthy animals, and the clean, orderly home. Each day she felt the invisible weight of fear and hopelessness lift a little more. She smiled at small accomplishments, celebrated progress, and discovered the satisfaction of seeing her efforts bear fruit. As her confidence grew, Maria also began to explore her creative side. She had started writing in secret at first, filling notebooks with thoughts, stories, and dreams. But now, encouraged by Jack's quiet support, she shared her writings with him. He read them carefully, offering gentle guidance but never criticism. "Your words are strong," he said one evening as they watched the sunset.
They matter, and they can help people.
Maria felt a surge of pride. For the first time, she understood that her voice could be more than a whisper in the dark. It could be heard, it could inspire, and it could change lives. Over time, Maria's writing evolved. She began telling the stories of girls and women she had known in her town, people trapped by circumstance, overlooked or ignored by the world. She wrote about courage, hope, and the possibility of a better life. Each word she put on paper felt like a step toward healing, a reclamation of the voice that had been silenced for so long. Her notebooks grew thicker, filled with tales of resilience and determination, and she realized that her experiences, painful as they had been, had given her wisdom and empathy that few others could claim.
Despite the progress she made, life was not without challenges. The shadows of her past sometimes returned unexpectedly.
Memories of her uncle's cruelty, the fear of the auction, and the uncertainty she had felt as a child surfaced at times, especially when she faced new responsibilities or setbacks. But now, unlike before, Maria had tools to cope. She could talk to Jack, reflect on her writing, and draw strength from her accomplishments. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to move forward despite it. She had learned that setbacks were temporary and that hope, once nurtured, could be a powerful guide. One day, while tending the garden, Maria noticed a young girl peering over the fence. She was timid, shy, and clearly unsure of herself, much like Maria had been when she first arrived at the ranch. The girl had been sent by her family to work, but she looked unhappy and scared. Maria approached her gently, remembering her own fear, and spoke softly. Hello, she said. You don't have to be afraid here. Come with me. The girl hesitated, but Maria's calm presence encouraged her to step forward. In that moment, Maria realized that her journey was not just about her own freedom and growth, it was also about helping others find courage and hope. Maria began mentoring the young girl, teaching her to care for the animals, to ride horses, and to take pride in her work. She shared her own story, not to frighten, but to inspire, showing that even in the darkest times there was a path to freedom and self-discovery. The girl responded with curiosity and determination, and Maria felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She understood now that her experiences, painful as they had been, could serve a purpose. By guiding others, she could ensure that no one would feel trapped or powerless as she once had. Her life continued in this way, a balance of work, learning, and mentoring, but Maria's dreams stretched further. She wanted to reach beyond the ranch, beyond the hills and mountains she had come to love, and make a difference in the wider world. She dreamed of sharing her writings with more people, of inspiring girls and young women who had been silenced by circumstance. She dreamed of traveling, learning, and discovering the world outside the small town where she had once lived in fear. These dreams no longer seemed impossible. They seemed attainable. If she continued to work, learn, and believe in herself, Jack remained a constant presence, quietly supporting her without demanding anything in return. He celebrated her successes, comforted her in difficult moments, and allowed her to make her own decisions. He had given her freedom once, but more importantly, he had shown her what true trust and guidance looked like. Maria often reflected on the day of the auction, the moment when her life had changed forever. She realized that while Jack had rescued her physically, it was the lessons, support, and encouragement that had truly allowed her to grow and thrive. One morning, Maria received a letter from a nearby town inviting her to speak at a small gathering about young women overcoming adversity. She was nervous at first, unsure if she had the courage to share her story publicly, but she remembered all she had learned over the years. With Jack's encouragement, she accepted. Standing before the audience, Maria spoke with clarity and confidence, telling her story, sharing her experiences, and inspiring others with her message of hope. The crowd listened intently, moved by her words, and Maria felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had found her voice, and she knew that it could make a difference.
As the seasons changed, Maria continued to grow.
She expanded the ranch slightly, planting more crops and caring for more animals. She helped other children and young women who found themselves in difficult circumstances, offering them guidance, education, and hope. Her writings were read by people in nearby towns, and her reputation as a brave and inspiring young woman spread. Through her efforts, she created a small community built on trust, care, and empowerment, a stark contrast to the fear and cruelty of her early years. Maria often thought of her mother, whose love had nurtured her early years, and of the uncle who had tried to break her spirit. She did not carry anger in her heart for long. Instead, she used those memories as lessons. Her mother's kindness had taught her love, patience, and empathy. Her uncle's cruelty had shown her the importance of courage, resilience, and fighting for one's own life. These lessons, combined with her experiences at the ranch, shaped Maria into a strong, compassionate, and determined young woman. As Maria's confidence grew, so did her ability to imagine and plan for the future. She dreamed of opening a small school for girls where they could learn reading, writing, and practical skills, and most importantly, where they could feel safe and valued. She wanted to ensure that no child would experience the fear she had known, that every young person could feel the power of their own voice and choices. She began gathering materials, seeking guidance from teachers in nearby towns, and making plans that were both practical and ambitious. With every step, she moved closer to turning her dreams into reality. Jack remained quietly proud of Maria's growth. He had saved her from immediate danger, but he had also given her the tools to thrive independently. He never took credit, never demanded gratitude, but simply supported her journey. Maria often reflected on their relationship with gratitude, understanding that true help was not just about rescuing someone, it was about teaching them to rise, to trust themselves, and to embrace their own potential. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Maria stood on the porch of the ranch house, looking out over the fields she had helped nurture and the animals she had learned to care for. She thought about her journey, the fear, the struggle, the courage, and the growth. She thought about the day of the auction, the moment when her life had changed, and she felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Jack, but for every lesson, every struggle, and every small victory that had brought her to this point. She realized that her life was no longer defined by fear or by the cruelty of others. It was defined by courage, resilience, and the ability to dream. Maria understood that her story was not just her own. It was a story that could inspire others, a story of hope, freedom, and the power of the human spirit. She had survived the worst, but she had not only survived, she had grown, thrived, and found her purpose. She knew that challenges would continue to come, as they do for everyone, but she now faced the future with confidence and determination. She had reclaimed her dreams, and she was determined to help others do the same. The ranch, the animals, the fields, and the quiet hills became a symbol of Maria's resilience. It was a place where fear could not control her, where kindness and hard work nurtured growth, and where she could continue to inspire others. Maria's life was no longer dictated by someone else's greed or cruelty. It was shaped by her own choices, her own courage, and her own dreams. She had discovered the power of hope, the strength of perseverance, and the importance of believing in herself. By the time Maria reached adulthood, she had become a respected and admired figure in the nearby towns. People came to her for guidance, for support, and for inspiration. Young girls in particular looked up to her, seeing in her a role model who had endured great hardship and emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Maria's life had come full circle, from fear and oppression to freedom, empowerment, and the ability to make a difference. She understood that true success was not measured by wealth or status, but by the ability to help others, to live with integrity, and to nurture one's own dreams. Maria often reflected on the auction day, not with pain or anger, but with understanding. That day had been the turning point, the moment when the possibility of a new life became real. It was the moment that allowed her to step into freedom, to learn, to grow, and ultimately to reclaim her dreams. Every step she had taken since then had built upon that day, leading her to a life filled with purpose, hope, and compassion. And as Maria stood on the porch one evening, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, she felt a deep sense of peace. The girl who had once been sold like property had become a woman who could shape her own destiny, who could inspire others, and who could live freely and fully. She had survived, she had grown, and she had achieved what she had once thought impossible. Her dreams were no longer distant. They were real, and they were hers.